Sometimes coming outside and touching grass is helpful, especially after finishing the vault in Final Fantasy XIV and losing one of my favorite characters, Harshfont, Lord Harshfont. That was very unexpected, and at this point, I consider Final Fantasy XIV to be paid trauma. I'm literally paying for trauma as they kill all my favorite characters. So yeah, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking and processing through the vault and the MSQ up until this point. So buckle up, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having a great day. Let's get into it. Final Fantasy XIV is back at it with its trauma-inducing story arcs. I just finished the vault in Final Fantasy XIV, and I was not prepared whatsoever for what I experienced. I finished it a mere few hours ago and immediately wanted to share my thoughts on this experience. And now this video will talk and touch on other parts of the Heavensward MSQ and maybe some elements from A Realm Reborn, but generally it's all going to be aimed towards the experience of a new player experiencing the vault in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, coming through the initial phases of Heavensward MSQ, I will say it's been very enjoyable. I love traveling the lands, seeing Lady Iceheart's story evolve, the Azure Dragoon, him accompanying us with different fights and battles. It's been very, very nice, and especially exploring different lands that have a vast array of dragon species and seeing the history kind of unveil about what actually took place between Ishgard and the dragons of old. That's been very interesting. As well as exploring King Thordan. Thordan the Seventh, I believe, is his actual name. Exploring his arc has been interesting. As of this point, as of making this video, I have not made it past the cutscene at the very end of the vault, so I don't know how the story will continue. I will hypothesize as always, but when I first laid eyes on Thordan, something was just not quite right about him. Obviously, that's probably really good story writing. You have this elderly figure draped in what I can call Pope-like clothing, right? Very religious-inspired clothing. But also having facial features that kind of draw out more of the villain type aesthetic, which I think is very interesting. So it leaves the viewer or the player kind of wondering where Thordan sits in the whole story arc, right? We do see a cutscene earlier in the MSQ where we see the bad guys, and forgive me for not remembering that group's name. The bad guys appear to King Thordan and appear to be striking up some sort of deal, which Thordan then replies and says that he's essentially keeping them in his pocket for self-interest. But as the arc continues and we approach the vault dungeon, it seems like things begin to change. We learn that Thordan actually has a bastard son, which is really interesting if you take some time like I did and kind of explore some of the Ishgardian theology, which in my opinion draws very, very heavily from Catholicism and the real world. I see these similarities both in the languages and the titles of different significant people in the city of Ishgard. We see a huge emphasis on theology. If you visit, there's a part of the game where if you visit in Ishgard, you see what looks to be like a study or a classroom. And in that location, you meet a lot of theologians in Ishgard and their understandings of the world, which is super interesting. Coming back to the MSQ in Heavensward, seeing this build-up in story of Harshfont and Sir Amric, how these characters kind of interface with the Warrior of Light, it really adds a really deep connection amongst these characters. So the grand reveal of Sir Amric being the bastard son of Lord Thordan, that's a really interesting moment, because again, drawing in from those Catholicism ties, priests and popes can't be married, so having children would be heavily looked down upon. That's a really interesting theme to actually play out, and it adds a lot of different thoughts I have about how this MSQ will ultimately play out. But also even just the storyline on how Harchfont is actually so integrated into the Warrior of Light's quest, which really makes the end of the vault so incredibly painful. If I rewind it back just a little bit, it is interesting to see how, in my opinion, how the word, Heaven's Word, evolves through the MSQ. So when we start the MSQ, or when we start the expansion, the DLC, sorry, not DLC, but when we start this particular Heaven's Word expansion of the game, there's a phrase that gets played on the screen, something to the effect of saying, we look to the sky as Heaven's Word, or something like that. And I thought when I read that line, it was so inspiring because it was like drawing hope by lifting your eyes, right? The Warrior of Light at that time being persecuted and chased out and into Ishgard, and then lifting his eyes for hope to the city of Ishgard was very, very powerful. So looking Heaven's Word as a directional gaze is beautiful and it's poetic. However, as you progress in the MSQ, you realize that there's also something called the Heaven's Ward. And when you first actually see the Heaven's Ward in full action, it really causes you to wonder, where did they get their strength? Where did they get their power from? Seeing them grow in tremendous size and strength actually in combat during the Vault dungeon, it was shocking, right? So to fight these guys, it was very unexpected. They're clearly not operating out of pure human strength. And now, granted, this is all speculation. I don't know how it's going to play out. I don't know if they made a deal with the bad guys from, again, forgive me for not remembering the name, but the bad guys from A Realm Reborn, the dark cloaked individuals, or if they made maybe some pact or deal with something along the lines of an icon, right? I'm curious to know how that's going to play out, but to see how perhaps Heaven's Ward is not as pure as they claim to be, which was clearly revealed in the withholding of information from the history, but it really changes your experience of the word Heaven's Word, or it certainly calls into question the authenticity or even just the sanctity of the Heaven's Ward. It's very interesting the emotions that subtle transition actually plays out on the player. I would like to touch on one more point before getting to the actual Vault experience, and that is the overwhelming theme that I'm personally picking up on when it comes to religious trauma. Now, some of the themes can be revealed through the relationship between Thordan and his bastard son, Sir Amric. That's a very interesting dynamic, but also just seeing the color palettes change, which I'll get to in a minute. But as I've been playing the MSQ, there's actually a song that kept coming to mind, and it really hit home in the grand reveal of Sir Amric's relationship with Thordan. The song is called Stained Glass by a band named Holy Name. And I'm going to read you these lyrics, and you can probably see where I'm going with this. The lyrics read, "Through stained glass, I've found a sacred space. You were like a father to me, but you're like the father of lies. These years past, I'm left here and disgraced, abandoned and used." So when I heard that song, which has been on rotation in my workout playlist, it's clearly talking about this sense of religious trauma, the stained glass being a metaphor or poetic when it comes to perhaps the imagery of a church. But as that song has been on rotation and I've been going through the MSQ, I really do feel very deeply for Sir Amric, but it also brings just a different level of, I don't want to say hatred, but extreme dislike for Thordan, and the history being withheld from the Ishgardians and it being used to create this narrative. It's all very convoluted, it's full of lies, and it really hit home for me personally, especially with this song that has been in rotation in my life. But there's something really, really interesting about the color theme that has been playing out in the MSQ. Up until this point, up until the vault, the colors of Ishgard and most of the quests have all been blues, dark purples, things that communicate cold, snow, like deep whites or stony roads covered in, sleet. It creates the sense, and this is actually brought home by the trailer as well. You're traveling into the mountains, it's cold, it's snowy, and the first time you really see a different color palette is when you go to the land of the dragons. But besides that, it was actually very juxtaposing when you go from the city of Ishgard to the vault, because when you play the vault, all the color schemes are what I would consider the golden hour colors. They're bronze, it's yellow, there's hint of orange, there's a glow. And those typically are reserved for a positive, more uplifting vibe. So when you apply those colors to the corruption of the Holy See, it really creates a unique emotional experience. And I think that artistically, that exact same juxtaposition is actually used a lot in really good story writing. A really good example of this outside of Final Fantasy XIV is actually the same use of colors in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Ganon's castle. When you ascend the staircase, you see the sunlight bleeding into the royal room, which creates the sense of what ought to be a place of trustworthiness, authority. It's actually the opposite. And seeing that in Final Fantasy XIV, the Holy See, in the Vault, it's a very familiar experience, but it really brings out those emotions of mistrust and religious trauma, because the Holy See is supposed to be there to protect the people, and it's doing the exact, well, I want to say it's not doing the exact opposite, but it's going about it in a way that, one, puts its people in harm's way, but it's also doing it in a way that is through deceit. So I guess technically it could be considered directly opposite. But the color schemes, I think, are super interesting when you consider exactly what's taking place in the dungeon of the vault. It's very, very interesting if you look at that artistically. Also, at the end of the vault, there were these gargoyles that came to life. There's two of them towards the end of the vault. And again, that just kind of brings home the theme, the artistic theme of corruption or evil, which I think is very interesting that those are placed inside of the Holy See's vault. Again, bringing home this message that the Holy See is a place of deceit, corruption, and the further you go into the vault, the more that stuff begins to come out. Now, when it comes to the actual end scene, that final movie clip at the end of the vault, and seeing Harshfont get just absolutely obliterated, laying his life down for the Warrior of Light, one was very unexpected. At least for me it was. I had no foreshadowing of losing Lord Harshfont. I did subconsciously, I did wonder why there was so much of this relational building happening between Harshfont and the Warrior of Light, but I thought that would just be because Harshfont was going to play a significant role later in the story, which now, seeing him dead, is not going to be possible, which really sucks, because I think his character was really well written, and I really loved just the uniqueness of his character. But I think the beauty of his character was really found in the fact that he so willingly laid down his life for the Warrior of Light. That whole experience was, I would say, emotional, especially if you allow yourself to be immersed into the story. If you let yourself succumb to the writing, you can really experience a lot of depth of emotion, which is something I felt a lot in A Realm Reborn. But when it came to Lord Harshfont specifically, there was a phrase at the very end from Alfie, and this is what, for me, just absolutely messed me up. He says, "The wound will not mend." It's something to that effect, that it's so deep that the wound will not mend. And just seeing Lord Harshfont in his final moments, just laying there on the cold
path outside of the vault while you have these religious leaders escaping. It's an emotional moment. As a player, I had no foreshadowing that I personally picked up on that was leading to his death, which made that moment just all the more shocking. Again, I actually queued up just wanting to clear the dungeon, not knowing that the vault actually had a really significant moment in the story. Otherwise, I would have recorded my actual live reaction. I didn't know that the vault was going to be this moment of just incredible turmoil. So please forgive me for not capturing that moment for all of you viewers, but I did at least want to talk about my experience as a player from the beginning of MSQ, going through the vault and other aspects as these characters are built up, and then ultimately seeing this climatic moment where Harshfont is slain in battle. And that was a hard moment for sure. In terms of theories about what I imagine would be coming up is there's going to be a grand reveal about how the Heaven's Ward has these really unnatural abilities to grow in size and superhuman strength. I'm really interested to see how that happens. I would imagine there's something supernatural. Either they made a pact and they were granted those powers from the bad guys from A Realm Reborn, or there's something to do with maybe Ifrit or some of the other icons. Maybe there's something happening there. Because again, there's been this huge buildup of significance when it comes to people summoning, like Lady Iceheart, for example, people summoning these deities for power and strength. So maybe there's something there happening. I will say there's going to be some sort of climatic moment with Thordan. I would imagine that he gets slain. That's how I see the story kind of resolving, at least. There's going to be some sort of moment between Sir Amaric and Thordan, I think, before that death that kind of brings some closure, or maybe sets up Sir Amaric for another character arc. So maybe he doesn't get the closure, but it sets him up for more in-depth character, more significance in the rest of Heaven's Word MSQ. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are about my theories and sort of my in-depth emotional feelings about this whole experience when it comes to the vault. Let me know what you're thinking. Drop a comment down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around. I'm going to be putting out a lot more Final Fantasy content in the future. Hope you're doing well. See you soon. Bye.